Hey all, welcome back to Mike Reads the World, where I'll be discussing the fourth Brazilian author now that I've covered, and she's actually the first of all of them that I heard about, so kind of who I've had in the back of my mind to read her works for a long time, and I thought this is really the time to do it, and I have done it the last week and a half, and I really want to discuss and share her works with the world because even though, I mean, according to one of the two books I have here, she is the author who has sold the most books from Brazil, like worldwide, which I actually am not sure if that is still an up-to-date statistic, but at one point that was true. I feel like no one I've talked to has really heard of her or read her. So I first became familiar with her in a university class about urban geography in South America, and she kind of appeared in this collection of books, of writings that, you know, we're supposed to read for the class, and of sort of different sources about urbanization in South America over the centuries. And her Quarto do Despejo, there was an excerpt from Child of the Dark, it's translated into English, which are quite different titles. Child of the Dark in English, but Quarto de Despejo actually means like the trash room. And she's of course referring to the favela that she lived in the late 1950s. So that is what Child of the Dark is about, and this was heavily edited from her diaries. She basically handed her diaries over to a journalist who edited them and then got them published. She made enough money where she was able to buy kind of a house in a lower middle class suburb, so definitely a step up from the favela, but nothing too extravagant. And then she published a second book, which didn't sell as well, and then she never published or widely sold anything else in her lifetime. She's most famous for Child of the Dark or Quarto do Despejo. And so it's kind of a sad story because the stuff she writes about in Quarto do Despejo or Child of the Dark is really, she talks a lot about just wanting to get out of the favela, how the favela should never exist. She writes about kind of how hard the life is, and not just how hard it is, but I think what really gets to you as you read it is just how dehumanizing it is. You're living in the trash room of society is really the picture that is painted. But it's a sad story because she gets out of it, and the stuff that I read in the unedited diaries here, which I actually think if you're interested in Carolina Maria de Jesus, you really should get both of these books. Because Child of the Dark is, of course, the famous one, the one that most people have read, and that really told the story of life in the favela. And but the unedited diaries are really excellent supplements that give you insight into her personality, more of her poetry, and I really can't imagine reading one without the other, having done so. And I'll talk a little bit more about the differences as I go on. But I just bring that up because in this unedited diary, we get more of her life after she got out of the favela, and she's not happier. She's not happier because of it, and actually ends up moving to the outskirts of the city and ending up as poor as when she began, despite having sold the book that sold the most copies worldwide from Brazil. But again, I don't know how up to date that statistic is. But so anyway, let's kind of just talk about some of the details. Carolina Maria de Jesus is really a personality that comes off the page, as a lot of my favorite books are, and it's one of those books that as you read the entire thing, you feel like you really get to know this woman. She doesn't mince words. She is extremely critical of people's vices, of alcoholism, of mothers who don't care for their children. She is, and she's not a perfect person. She is a single mother of three children herself. I believe she had them with three different men as well. So this also gets into an interesting thing about how she has been perceived, because as it explains in the introduction to the unedited diaries, she wasn't radical enough really for the left, but she was way too, she definitely, just by that description I gave, she did not fit into the standards of the conservative Brazilians as far as being a discreet and temperate woman, right? So she never really got a lot of support from anybody, and her fame actually kind of seems to not have made her many friends at all. In fact, the opposite. As she moved out of the favela, there's a story here that the other people that lived in the favela threw stones at the moving truck, and in fact resented her greatly for writing about them in her diary. And as she's become well known, actually some articles got published before her book was even published, and there are incidents in the book where people will make references like, "What, you're gonna write about me in your little book?" Or and I couldn't help but think, of like Sei Shonagon in Heian-era Japan, writing the Pillow Book, and once her stories got well known, it seems like she was met with a lot of criticism, and not stories, but her basically she wrote kind of just about daily life and her lived experiences. So it functionally, when people would read this, it was like reading her diary entry, and she would just write about people, her thoughts about people, without imagining anyone would read them. And so people started to not like her very much when they read her unfiltered thoughts. And but the big difference here, I think, is that Carolina Maria de Jesus always had a strong intention of people reading her work. She dearly wanted to be a writer and a published author and poet. And even the story of how she was discovered shouting at some kind of political mafia people who were in her neighborhood that she was going to write about them in her book, and this journalist or editor happened to hear her. It's like she wrote stories and poems that have never seen the light of day, have never been published. But the world has only really been interested in her diary. So it's one of those things where what we don't have is also kind of as interesting and makes you wonder. Though in, I think, the introduction of Child of the Dark, it describes her poems and stories as childish, and so kind of gets written off. But I personally am very curious to read more of her poetry and actually know what kind of stories and plays and things she wrote. So with that, but first and foremost, this is slice of life in a favela and then moving out of it, but also a glimpse into the mind of somebody who dreams of being a writer, who sees themselves as a great poet, whether the world sees them that way or not. And there's this sort of, despite all of the horrible things that she is dealing with and seeing and just trying to survive through the favela, there is this sort of like innocent, childlike imagination of hers that comes through, and this is very complicated too, because there are times when, for example, she will beat her children, use physical punishment on her children, and justifies it in passages. In one particular case, she beats her son for reading comic books, and And so we're not here to present her as like some perfect person, some hero, right? But so she beats her son for reading comic books when she herself spends her early mornings. She gets up at 3, 4 in the morning. You know, makes me at 2 in the morning one day to write. You know, makes me look lazy for now getting up at 6 in the morning to do this video. That's nothing. So it's like she beats her son for reading comic books while she herself indulges in her world of fantasy, and it's like there's this sort of like she's always struggling, it almost seems, against this sort of shame society wants to put on her for pursuing something as frivolous as writing, and there's a really complex psychology to all that. So I think in some ways when you read a lot of authors around the world, you have to withhold judgment and try to just see things as they are in all their complexity. And we should probably be doing that often on a daily basis. But it gets hard, right? Because we all kind of have our moral lines that we draw and say, well, I would never do that. But, you know, when you read it and you really inhabit the mind of it, you look at, for example, she'll look at a group of boys who are planning to rob somebody, and she thinks their mother doesn't even do anything, just tells them to stop. She needs to like beat these boys into submission because otherwise they're going to rob somebody. You know, I'm paraphrasing very heavily here, but there's an incident like that. And I'm obviously, when I'm talking about these, I'm confusing the stuff that's in Child of the Dark with the unedited diaries. But before I start reading passages and things, I think this is a good time to kind of finish my thoughts about the differences. So the Child of the Dark, or Quarto do Despejo, is kind of written into it's basically her diaries before she got famous and got this book published from 1958, first 1955, then 1958 and 1959. There is a noted difference between 1955 and 1958, as you would expect, 3 years apart, and there's a separate charm to each. And again, I go back to thinking of, say, Shonagon, because there's a certain point in the Pillow Book where she becomes self-aware of her own writing. And I think that kind of happens to Carolina Maria de Jesus between the very early entries of 1955 and 1958. You get a much more raw look into life in the favela in 55, and some of it in 58 as well. But then in 59, we get a sort of wait-and-see period, as the unedited diaries tells us. And this is the part where the unedited diaries and the Child of the Dark overlap, is 1959. So you can compare a little bit of what's from 1959 in Child of the Dark to her unedited diaries and see how much the editor Dantas actually wrote out, or took out. And personally, I want to say I prefer the unedited diaries, but I also think that the way Dantas edits is very sharp and is very effective, but it does change her voice. It most definitely does change her voice, but in a way, Child of the Dark almost feels like a novelized version of events because it is so precise in what and how it's telling, whereas the unedited diaries really do just feel like a diary. Child of the Dark, or Quarto do Despejo, doesn't really feel like a diary, even though it feels like a novelized version of a diary, even though it is all, I mean, Dantas didn't invent anything. It is all Carolina Maria de Jesus's works. But the only reason now that we have the unedited diaries, it says, is due to Vera Eunice, the daughter of Carolina, actually helped in the 90s, helped them get this notebook where Carolina actually transcribed all these scraps of paper that she had written her diaries on, I'm assuming. I know that's how she started. She basically would collect whatever paper she could find to write, and so this stuff had to be like transcribed into notebooks. And so using one of these notebooks that Carolina transcribed her original diaries into, we were able to get the unedited diaries. So I guess we don't really know, were they unedited? They might have been edited a little bit by Carolina. I guess I don't really know if that is true, but anyway, thanks to her, Carolina's daughter, we have these unedited diaries. And so we get into 1961, which I haven't read the second book that she published, but I believe the 1961 diary overlaps a little bit with the second book of hers that got published, where she's now living in a lower class suburban neighborhood. So, and then beyond that, we get 1962, 1963, 64, and 66 excerpts, which kind of, we see Carolina Maria de Jesus's slow disenchantment with the, her success literature. She even becomes disenchanted with literature and writing, and she actually returns basically to her poorer life that she had before, and we kind of see that sort of return happen in those later excerpts. So I'm going to kind of just go through and share, some different parts of the book that stood out to me, as I typically do. And I think this is, for me, there were parts of this book that just really, really made me stop and think, and it's hard to qualify where this stands as like a favorite or not, but for being from somebody, to get this perspective is so rare in the world of literature, like shockingly rare and difficult, and confronts us with the fact that literature has been, and I mean, for the most part still is, something for the middle and upper classes, or I'm not saying that that's how it should be, but that's who gets published. That's, that's who dominates, just like pretty much in every other arena of life. And I would truly love to see in the world more diaries like this. And I'm sure there's gotta be people, hundreds, thousands, millions of people around the world in poor conditions writing about it. But their works just never see the light of day, I have to imagine. I don't know. It's something that I was thinking about a lot while reading this, and will be thinking about the rest of my life, I'm sure. Anyway, yeah. So actually I'm going to start with some excerpts from Quarto do Despejo. I marked a lot of things, details, like in the 1955 diaries, like the kids, dealing with like the kids getting worms, and there's sort of these half-hearted campaigns to try to get rid of these sort of diseases or worms, and there's a lot of talk about just the ineffectiveness of the municipalities, the governments. She goes on Carolina goes on political tirades now and then, for sure, which are far more often edited out in Child of the Dark versus the unedited diaries. And, she talks about fights in the favelas. She is heavily critical, as I mentioned, of mothers who don't treat their children well. She is very critical of use of alcohol. She doesn't drink herself, and she writes very often about how alcohol destroys people in the favela, both men and women. Her struggles to find food. She writes a lot about the management of money. There's always money lacking for this. It's really a slice of daily life, and it's not always pleasant. Most often it's not pleasant. Just as I'm reviewing this, but there are moments of sort of, you have like your races that they do in the neighborhood every year. There are sort of mentions of, carnival. And so it's not all it's not all bad stuff. You know, there's a time when Carolina gets a radio fixed up because her daughter wants a radio, and while on one hand she will, you know, beat her one of her children one day, the next day she's going out without food so that they can eat. And for a very strange parallel, I almost thought of sort of the sort of like pain of hunger that's transmitted in this book reminded me of Hunger by Knut Hamsun, except actually this is real. She writes about the sort of racism in Brazil that she experiences. So here's an excerpt that I think does a good job of from Child of the Dark, that actually, like her unedited diaries, kind of matches her. She has a bit of a chaotic mind and stream of consciousness way of writing, and the thoughts kind of cut off or switch in places without completing a thought, but creates like really interesting and thought-provoking juxtapositions. May 27th of 1955. I'm reading here. It seems that the slaughterhouse threw kerosene on their garbage dumps so the favelados would not look for meat to eat. I didn't have any breakfast and walked around half dizzy. The days of hunger is worse than that of alcohol. The days of alcohol makes us sing, but the one of hunger makes us shake. I know how horrible it is to only have air in the stomach. I began to have a bitter taste in my mouth. I thought, is there no end to the bitterness of life? I think that when I was born, I was marked by fate to go hungry. I filled one sack of paper. When I entered Paulo Guimarães Street, a woman gave me some newspapers. They were clean, and I went to the junkyard, picking up everything that I found. Steel, tin, coal, everything that serves the favelado. Leon weighed the paper, and I got 6 cruceros. So here it's like she is actually collecting the paper that she's going to use to, you know, write these diaries on, but also, of course, anything and everything she can find. I'll see if I can find something from 1958 quick here. Here's a good one from July 1st of 1958. I've been thinking that if this diary is ever published, it's going to make a lot of people angry. Here are people that, when they see me coming, go away from their windows or close their doors. These things don't bother me. In fact, it pleases me because then I don't have to stop and talk to them. When I went over to the factory, I saw many tomatoes. I was going to pick them up when the manager came out. I didn't go near because he doesn't like people to pick them up. When they unload the trucks, the tomatoes fall on the ground, and when the trucks pull out, they squash them. But human beings are like that. They prefer to see things spoil and let others get some use from them. When he went away, I picked up some anyway. Afterward, I went looking for more paper. Okay, yeah, so it's this sort of train of thought, but now she's starting to get that self-awareness of, you know, what this diary is going to mean. At this point, some articles about her had already been published, and she was already sort of a mini celebrity. 1958 is the greatest part of Child of the Dark, but 1959 has some really excellent passages. But I think I'll let you discover that for yourself. Well, here's a good one. She does write kind of around, like, while she appears to be Christian and, you know, writes in kind of praise of Jesus at one point or the other, but from kind of almost a little bit of an oblique perspective. But there's definitely a criticism of like the church and Christianity's hypocrisy in her country, you know, justifiably so. So anyway, I think at this point, a lot of the more interesting stuff to read, I think, is in her unedited diaries. And just from those two passages, I think if I read a couple things, you'll get an idea of the difference. I I got to the post office. They weighed the notebooks. 406. I thought, not here. There is no table of rates. Yesterday it was 412. I thought about the order and progress written on our flag. That's on the Brazilian flag. Ordem e progresso. But it doesn't prevail. I took the stamps. I glued them to the paper that the books were wrapped in. There were so many stamps that the notebooks looked dressed up. I took it to the window. Registered airmail. A. Gambino waited on me. Slip number 44,290, dispatching ticket number 837,936. I thought about the coincidence of number 936 to my life. Why the register number is 845,936. Senor Gambini told me to come by the post office. I told him, as soon as I received word from the United States telling me that the book has arrived, I would let him know. He told me to come by before that I was pleased. I told him that I was sending the originals to the United States because the publishers in Brazil didn't help poor writers. An embryo that doesn't evolve. An atrophied embryo. So it connects to what I was talking about before. This is when she is sending her book to the United States so that it can be published. Which it will be, and sell a lot. There's times when she writes in her unedited diaries just kind of, just these sort of rants that are really interesting to read. Let me see here. When there is a fight here in the favela, everybody fights, even the children. Petita was born a good person. After she married, she degenerated. She is the daughter of booze. I think she is perverse. Over-sexual stimulation mixed with alcohol. One notes that the child of an alcoholic is a slower learner. Their mentality is lethargic. I'm going to talk about Bahia, the first capital of Brazil. It already is 458 years old, and in the meantime, it is the state that didn't develop in culture. One or another stand out. The Bahians who come to Sao Paulo, the majority are semi-literate. They are ridiculous and agitators. Some days I miss our favela from 1950. We only had 2 families from the north, and very well behaved. Now, the favela is overflowing with northerners, and for the Paulistas, they are a different people. This isn't the only time she's going to write about how things were better in like the 1920s to 1950s. So, and this is a theme, I guess, that comes out rather subtly, but by the end it's very clear that industrialization in Brazil during the 1950s and 60s did not make life easier for the poor, but rather much harder and much more ugly in many respects. I like this part. The Portuguese woman who gave me the paper told me that she has known me for years. She told me that all poets go crazy. I told her that when I realized that I am a poetess, I became sad because the excess of imagination was too much. That I had my brain examined in the Hospital das Clínicas, that the examination result showed that I was calm. That I greatly educated my brain. That I did not let ideas overcome me. That the disrespect that people have for poets made me sad. But now I am in the mature state and don't get affected with the attentions of just anybody. That to those who please me, I am pleasing. Those who annoy me undergo hell with me. I told her that the whites of Brazil still enslave the blacks, a moral slavery, intimidating the black with prison. Most of all when the black makes a mistake and loses moral force. That I try not to err in order not to be dominated by the whites, that I make the whites kneel before me, that I sensed that working I didn't have poetic ideas and for this reason I decided to work, but I can't just sit around, that I tried different jobs and did well collecting paper because I am always walking, that I wanted to be included in Brazilian artistic circles, but I couldn't stand the boastfulness of Brazil's semi-stars, that I say semi-stars because I think that an artist needs culture, and to know how to deal with people to have a public. An artist who has a public brings profit to a businessman. That I prefer talking with a worker to talking with a Brazilian artist. Workers are agreeable when they talk and artists are majestic. They want to be idolized by the people. That I find the artists of Brazil very affected. that I am an observer. When I look at a person, I immediately form an opinion. In general, a dealings the worker is more pleasing. I passed Paixall factory to collect tomatoes. The manager there now is friendly. And we see in this passage so much of what makes her writing her writing. The malapropisms, which have their own charm, but sometimes unintentionally stimulate a different sort of thought. We get this sort of this stream of consciousness writing that just comes from the diary entry. It's not a cultivated stream of conscious that at least that I think it's just more it's just writing in a diary. I could be wrong, but it's messy. It has a messy charm to it, but it is still very easy and interesting to read. It's very good. I found this passage from the 1961 diary pretty interesting as well. So this is after she's moved into her lower middle class home and is starting to feel kind of miserable for a number of reasons. I have the impression that I am among millions of Judases. I don't like to be double-crossed. When I was a little girl, I thought, will I be able to live as I like, buy pretty dresses, live in a red house, my favorite color? Now that I bought the house, it wasn't possible to paint it red because the priests would say, Carolina is a communist. I would like to have a red tombstone, but the priests won't allow it because they want to order the poor around. The world to be good should be run by Jesus Christ, who is the superior spirit and has no ambition. They told me that the church has an organization called Metropolitano and it invests the alms in building construction to rent apartments. Why doesn't it use the money for the poor? When somebody appears defending the poor, the church damns them. They excommunicated Fidel Castro, and I, for writing this, already am a candidate for excommunication. We had noble priests who were interested in the education of the poor, wanting even to teach the Indians. My head was heavy with ideas. I thought, today I am going crazy. How horrible it is to have poetic thoughts. And this is why poets want to die. There are those who commit suicide, supposing that they will find tranquility in the tomb. I went into the emporium of Senor Antonio on the corner of Rua Alfredo Maya and asked him if the house on the corner had already sold. Once again, a passage that sums up a lot of where she starts going in 1961. As she moves into a lower middle class home, she observes that the white children don't treat her daughter with respect. She observes that everyone in the favela now hates her. She observes that her publishers are determining the little bit that she makes and the royalties are starting to decrease, that they are organizing tours for her, that they are managing her entire writing output now and organizing all these things, and she has no real freedom. She finds herself living in a hell now that her dreams have and she uses that word multiple times, now that her dreams have come true, and her thoughts continually are returning to those who have less than her. And she's still very unselfish about all of this. So there have been different portraits painted of her in like the introductions that say that, she wasn't radical enough for the left, but what she writes here, I kind of see her mind as time goes on here kind of leaning towards some socialist inclinations and, well, at the very least, a concern for the lower classes as a whole. And also, some people will paint her as that, no, all she wanted was just to get out of poverty. Well, that may have been true in the beginning, and that's usually when I think when you're not getting enough food, the only thing you want is enough food, right? I think that's pretty simple, but I think it's oversimplified to say that she was only, concerned about herself and her family, and that she was selfish about all this too. So there's, once again, contradictions make people more real, not less real. So, and another part I think that really reveals kind of all of this is she is asked in an interview, what motivated you to write such a confusing letter? And she responds, 7 things: sadness, disillusionment, I got sick of living and want to die. Deception, I seem to be amidst ferocious beasts, but the most ferocious is the worm. 5. I wasn't born to be teledirected. The worst thing there is for the people to see and be pulled in a halter as if one couldn't see or as if I was. 6. I wanted to rent this house and move out of here. 7. What bothers me are the requests for loans, and I can't lend. She gets people from the favela asking her for loans. She gets shopkeepers charging her more money because they know who she is. It's really, I really felt, even though she's moved up in life, it's almost convincing that she's really just moved kind of from one hell to the other, and she's even longing at one point for her days when she was collecting paper, forgetting, of course, about her former hunger, I think, but it's tough stuff to read and to think about. And again, the 1963 diary, this stuff kind of, there's one point, is it in 1962 here, where she actually, or 63 or 60, I can't remember, but she goes to an autograph signing where she actually meets Jorge, I don't know, it looks like Jorge in Spanish, but Jorge Amado, the Brazilian novelist who was really popular for a long time, and she hugs him and kind of writes almost like she has a little crush on him. But I thought that was kind of funny. We get very few, even though she says she reads a lot, we actually get very few references to her particular literary influences. I almost feel like her imagination is a place that she likes to think of all her own. And when she writes, when she's written poetry and written stories, the sense that I get is that they are very much from her own place of living in a castle, looking out at a garden. It's really a world of imagination and fantasy that's all her own. And I think this is important because she's not, when she talks about literature, she's talking about something that's, for her, been an escape from the miserable times that she's lived in, and not necessarily this sort of idea of literature as this great historic, legacy of humanity that sometimes we portray it of. And there's a number of reasons you could get into why that might be. I won't at this time, but very interesting to reflect on that. Though there is one time when she lists the names of men that she admires, and one of them, strikingly enough, is the Cuban author Alejo Carpentier. So that is kind of the one, besides Jorge Amado, that is sort of the one other author that she mentions. She also mentions the Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights at one point. So yeah, just kind of, I don't know, interesting stuff all over the book. I've just shared I shared way less than I actually marked. I guess I will finish here just with the line that ends the 1966 diary, because this is the last I know about her before her passing away in 1977. But there's this interesting allegory of Brazil being a man that needs a heart transplant, and he goes to all these different countries, and there's a great line here. Anyway, Brazil is now considering heart transplant surgery. He wants to change his military heart into a civilian heart, in a smaller but bolder handwriting. Brazil went under a transplant surgery even before Barnard, where he changed his civil heart and put a military heart in its place. Brazil is getting better from his inflation disease, and the tropical anemia is already cured. However, he still has tuberculosis, a disease he acquired from his old times of starvation. These are ill-bred and insolent daughters whose sorrowful parents regret their birthday. I wrote Quarto do Despejo, the book that made me known. According to others, that book was worth millions. However, it brought me, the author, no financial independence. The reason was that it was contracted to the international publishing houses that do not give me a dime. My royalties were irritants and disappointments, fatal royalties, capitalized. Yeah, it's not her. I never would describe her writing as pretty, but it's sharp and it gets a point across and it's powerful. And I think there's a lesson there for writers in general to write in your own voice. Because if your own voice isn't enough, nothing will be. And so we can all, of course, try to be better writers. I write and I think about writing a lot. But in the end, I know that all I have is my own voice. That is, of course, constantly evolving by what I read. But there's a certain voice, a certain mood that you need to, in the end, just trust. And if it's not good enough, it's not good enough. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I don't believe really in writing advice. I don't. And it's very interesting to juxtapose this while also reading Worldlight by Halldór Laxness, who, you know, is about a poor orphan boy from a village in Iceland, a place that, you know, could not be more different than urban Brazil favela in the 1950s. But I think what we can really learn from both scenarios is that it's not to express yourself poetically and through writing and through writing. You don't need to have a million books. You don't need to read a million books. But the ones you do read need to mean a lot to you, and you need to, in the end, trust in your own voice. And I'm about halfway through Worldlight. I look forward to discussing that one a lot, and hopefully we'll remember to kind of arch back to this point while I'm doing it. So early morning review, a little bit messy, a little bit early morning, not a morning person typically, but yeah, that is the unedited diaries of Carolina Maria de Jesus and Quarto do Despejo, or Child of the Dark. Hope you enjoyed, and this will probably, I won't say guaranteed, but likely be the last Brazilian work I cover in my Read Around the World project of 1001 Nights of Reading the World before it ends. And, well, definitely the last Brazilian author I'll be covering. Who knows? We might get another, you know, Machado de Assis or Lispector book in here. We'll see. We'll see. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.